I always thought I knew my wife, Lisa, better than anyone. We'd been together for over 20 years, built a successful life in San Diego, and run a thriving massage therapy business she poured her heart and soul into. I believed our foundation was rock solid. But about 3 months ago, things started to change. Subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss. But those changes gnawed at me. Lisa was spending more time at the salon, often claiming that new clients were keeping her busy. She'd always been upfront about her schedule before, but now, there was an edge of secrecy in her routine. I shrugged it off initially, convincing myself that I was just overthinking things. But when she started bringing her phone with her everywhere and smiling at her messages with a strange, distant look, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Last week, I decided to confront her. I tried to do it casually, asking how work was going and if everything was all right. She brushed me off with a smile, saying that the salon had just gotten busier, that there was nothing to worry about. I forced myself to smile back, but the doubts were already planted. That's when I decided to install the cameras. I never thought I'd become the kind of man who'd need to spy on his wife. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I told myself it was just to prove my suspicions wrong, to reassure myself that she was as devoted as she'd always been. But deep down, I was afraid of what I might find. I set up the cameras discreetly, one in the living room, another in her office. And then I waited. It took a few days before I finally had the nerve to watch the recordings. I sat alone in our house, the sound of my own heartbeat drowning out everything else as I pressed play. There he was. A man I'd never seen before, tall and broad-shouldered, with a confident swagger that made my blood boil. Lisa's demeanor around him was something I hadn't seen in years, playful, flirtatious. My heart sank as I watched them together, unable to tear my eyes away from the betrayal unfolding before me. The man was no stranger to her, and that much was clear. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My entire world, every bit of trust and love, crumbled in that moment. But I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. I needed more than this. I needed a plan, and I needed it to hurt as much as I was hurting. The first step was to dig deeper, to gather all the pieces before I made my move. And so, I waited. Because this time, I wouldn't let anything slip by unnoticed. After I uncovered the first clues of Lisa's betrayal, I was consumed by a storm of emotions, anger, disbelief, and a relentless need for answers. I couldn't just confront her right away. She would deny everything, I was sure of it. I had to be patient and meticulous if I was going to uncover the full extent of her deceit. I hired a private investigator the very next day. I needed to know more about this man she was with, and I needed proof that went beyond what I had already seen. My trust had been shattered, and there was no going back. The investigator worked quickly, and within a few days, I had a full report in my hands. The man, as I suspected, was Dante, the new massage therapist she'd hired for her spa. His background was shady at best, and he'd moved around frequently, always taking up short-term gigs that seemed to end in disaster. It seemed I wasn't the first husband to have my life upended by this guy. My blood boiled as I read through the details, each line fueling my resolve to make them both pay. But there was an even bigger shock waiting for me. After the investigator's report, I decided to check our personal safe, which we had always kept in the back of our bedroom closet. Inside, I usually kept a cash reserve, emergency funds, stashed for a rainy day. As I opened the safe, a wave of dread washed over me. The safe was completely empty. Nearly $1 million in cash, gone. She had taken it all. She knew the code, and she'd seen me use it countless times. I felt a surge of rage like nothing I'd ever known. This wasn't just about an affair anymore, she was stealing from me, planning for a future that didn't include me. She was going to walk away with everything. I returned to the surveillance footage, and there it was, Elisa and Dante, in our home, laughing and toasting with champagne, like they had already won. They had no idea I was watching, that I was gathering evidence, planning each step to ensure that when this was over, they'd be left with nothing. I wasn't going to be a victim. I quickly took action. I had the bank accounts transferred solely into my name and moved any remaining funds into new, undisclosed accounts. She would have nothing but the ashes of what she'd destroyed. This was no longer just about betrayal, this was about reclaiming everything she'd taken from me, and making sure she'd suffer for what she'd done. As for Dante, I planned to deal with him later. First, I needed the results of the DNA test to confirm what I feared most. If our son wasn't mine, then she had taken not just my money and my trust, but my entire life. And there was no way I'd let her walk away unscathed. In the days that followed, I lay low, watching, waiting, gathering every piece of the puzzle. Soon, the picture would be complete, and I'd make my move. She thought she could deceive me, but I was 10 steps ahead. When the time came, I'd strike with the full force of everything she'd taken for granted. I sat with my son after revealing the truth, wondering how he'd react. He didn't pull away, instead, he looked at me with a steady gaze. "You're my dad, and nothing will change that," he said, his voice unwavering. Hearing those words gave me a strange sense of peace. No piece of paper, no betrayal from Lisa, could erase what we shared. He was my son in every way that mattered. The next few days were a blur of planning. I filed for emergency custody, intending to keep him away from Lisa and her lover, Dante. But I needed more than just legal action, I needed to ensure she couldn't manipulate him or twist the situation in her favor. We had to make her understand that she wasn't in control. Just when I thought we'd covered everything, a new twist threw us off course. My son handed me a small, nondescript envelope he'd found while looking for some old family photos. "I thought this might be important," he said, unsure of what he'd stumbled upon. Inside, I found a series of documents, bank statements from an account I didn't recognize. The account had frequent transactions over the past few years, and the name on it wasn't Lisa's, it was Dante's. She'd been funneling money to him for years, far longer than I'd suspected. It hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a fling. It was a calculated scheme, and Dante had likely been helping Lisa siphon money from our finances long before I caught on. She was even planning to transfer the deed to our house into his name, right under my nose. This betrayal was far deeper than I'd thought. They weren't just planning to run away together, they were planning to strip me of everything I owned. Fueled by rage, I called my lawyer and arranged a meeting with a private investigator to track down every trace of their scheme. If Lisa and Dante thought they could get away with this, they had another thing coming. I wasn't about to let them steal everything I'd built, let alone my relationship with my son. It didn't take long for the investigator to find a lead. Dante had been hiding assets under multiple aliases, and Lisa had been aiding him, using her business as a front to launder their money. With this evidence, I had what I needed to make my next move. I would freeze every account, seize every asset, and make sure they ended up with nothing. The tension between us grew as I began the legal process to secure the house and retrieve the money. But as I was taking steps to secure our future, another bombshell dropped. I received a notice from a private investigator I hadn't hired. Curious, I arranged a meeting, only to discover that Dante had hired someone to follow me. He'd been trying to find dirt on me, looking for anything he could use to ruin my reputation and ensure I wouldn't win custody of my son. The depth of their betrayal knew no bounds. But if Dante wanted a war, he'd get one. I shared everything with my son, who listened intently and nodded. "What can I do to help?" he asked, his resolve as strong as my own. In that moment, I knew that we were in this together, truly united against whatever came next. I told him I needed him to stay strong, to act as though nothing was wrong when he was around his mother. I wanted him to be my eyes and ears. He agreed, willing to do whatever it took to protect what we had left. The next day, he went over to Lisa's house, playing along, acting as though he wasn't aware of anything going on. Meanwhile, I secured everything in preparation for the battle ahead. As I watched him walk away that day, I felt a pang of sadness, but also a renewed sense of purpose. My son wasn't just standing with me, he was a crucial part of the plan. Lisa and Dante thought they could fool me, but they'd underestimated the strength of our bond. They had no idea what was coming for them. With each passing day, a plan took shape. My son continued playing his role flawlessly, feeding me every detail about Lisa and Dante's movements. He'd become my greatest ally, and together, we were tightening the net around them. As we gathered more evidence of their deceit, we knew the time was near for the trap to spring shut. One evening, my son returned from a weekend at Lisa's house, carrying more than just the updates I'd been expecting. He handed me a flash drive he'd found hidden in one of Dante's gym bags. "I think this has everything you need," he whispered. My heart raced as I plugged it into my laptop, hoping we'd finally found the final piece to take them down. On the drive, we found financial records, bank accounts, transfer details, and evidence of money laundering through Lisa's business. It was even worse than I'd thought. They hadn't just siphoned off money from our accounts. They were involved in fraud and laundering on a scale I hadn't imagined. We had them. With this information, we could make sure they'd be left with nothing but the wreckage of their schemes. But the real surprise came as I dug through the files. Hidden among the financial documents was a folder labeled insurance. Inside, I found photos of me, taken from a distance, some of them clearly recent. Dante had been watching me closely. As I looked closer, it became clear he'd been planning something far worse than stealing my money. It looked like he'd been planning to frame me for their crimes. They'd been covering their tracks, shifting money to make it appear like I was the mastermind. They'd intended to take it all and leave me to bear the consequences. At that moment, I realized just how deeply they'd planned this betrayal. They didn't just want to run away with my money. They wanted to destroy my life completely. But I wasn't about to let them get away with it. The next step in our plan required precision. I called my lawyer and gave him the information from the drive. I wanted to make sure that Lisa and Dante were exposed publicly, that they'd have nowhere to hide. My son and I worked together, compiling all the evidence, preparing for the moment when we would confront them. I wanted them to know exactly who had orchestrated their downfall. The following weekend, Lisa picked up our son for another visit, completely unaware of what we had in store for her. Before she left, he slipped a small recording device into her purse, ensuring that we'd have evidence of any conversation they had about their plans. My son had gone from a quiet observer to a full partner in our scheme. I couldn't have been prouder, even though a part of me wished we weren't in this situation at all. It didn't take long for the recordings to yield results. That evening, I listened in as Lisa and Dante discussed their plans, how they intended to liquidate our remaining assets and vanish. The sense of betrayal burned within me, but I knew we had everything we needed to make our move. With the evidence in hand, I reached out to the authorities, ensuring they had copies of all the documents and recordings. I wanted to be thorough, there would be no escape for either of them. But we weren't done yet. I wanted Lisa to see the wreckage of her own making. I wanted her to know, in no uncertain terms, that I had beaten them at their own game. When the authorities moved in, my son and I were there, watching as they were both arrested, Dante in the parking lot of her spa and Lisa at home, confused and furious as they cuffed her. She caught sight of us as they put her in the car, a mixture of shock and rage in her eyes. "You did this," she screamed, and I smiled, feeling no remorse. My son turned to me and said, "Let's go home, Dad." I knew then that no matter what they'd taken from us, we still had each other. And that was something they could never destroy. Watching Lisa and Dante in handcuffs was satisfying, but the battle wasn't over yet. As I'd come to realize, getting them arrested was only the first step. I wanted to make sure they'd lose everything, with no way to rebuild their lives on what they'd stolen from me. The charges for fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy were serious, but I needed to ensure the fallout was absolute. The morning after the arrest, my son and I met with our lawyer and the district attorney. The evidence we'd gathered was overwhelming, but we needed to fortify our case. The DA was on our side, determined to see justice served. With his help, we began the process of freezing Lisa's and Dante's assets, seizing any hidden accounts, and securing injunctions to prevent them from accessing any financial resources. However, that wasn't enough. I wanted to ensure that even if they managed to evade the legal consequences, they'd have nothing left to come back to. I reached out to the media, giving them a detailed account of Lisa's and Dante's schemes. Soon, stories about their betrayal and crimes were plastered all over the local news. It was humiliating and exposed them for what they truly were. Their reputations were destroyed overnight. But there was one more blow I wanted to deliver. I found out that Lisa's spa, which she valued above all else, was tied up in her finances. If I could gain control over it, she'd be left with nothing but the ruins of the life she'd tried to build with Dante. Using the evidence we'd collected, we filed a civil suit against her, seeking compensation for emotional damages, financial fraud, and breach of trust. The case was airtight, and with the media coverage intensifying, there was no way she could defend herself. When the court date arrived, my son and I sat across from her in the courtroom. She looked gaunt, like she hadn't slept in days. Dante was nowhere to be seen. He'd been remanded without bail, awaiting his own trial for numerous counts of fraud and money laundering. Lisa's lawyer tried to paint her as a victim, manipulated by Dante, but the evidence we'd gathered left no room for doubt. She had willingly and knowingly participated in every part of the scheme. As the verdict was read, the judge ruled in our favor, granting us full control over her business and ordering her to pay damages. She'd be left with nothing but the ashes of the life she tried to steal. And as she was led out of the courtroom, our eyes met one last time. There was no anger left in me, just a cold sense of finality. She'd made her choices, and now she'd have to live with them. My son and I walked out of the courthouse together, feeling a strange sense of relief. We had been through hell, but we'd emerged stronger. In the weeks that followed, I sold the spa, using the funds to secure a new future for us both. We moved to a new home, leaving behind the remnants of our past. The wounds from Lisa's betrayal would take time to heal, but we had each other. One evening, as we sat together in our new living room, my son looked over at me and said, "We did it, Dad. She's gone, and she can't hurt us anymore." I nodded, knowing that while our scars might never fully fade, we were finally free. As for Lisa and Dante, they'd be left to pick up the pieces of the wreckage they'd created. They thought they could take everything from me, but in the end, they had nothing. And I had everything that mattered. With the court battles behind us and Lisa and Dante locked away, my son and I were finally free to start fresh. Selling her spa had given us the financial security we needed, and moving into a new home felt like closing a painful chapter. We were both still healing, but for the first time, we could look ahead without the weight of the past pulling us down. One evening, as we unpacked the last of our boxes, my son turned to me with a question that caught me off guard. "Do you think she'll try to come back, even after all this?" he asked, his voice hesitant. I knew the pain was still fresh for him, too. While Lisa and Dante were behind bars now, I could sense he was afraid they'd find a way to intrude on our lives again. I wanted to reassure him. "She's lost everything, son. She has no power over us now." But even as I said the words, a part of me wondered if it was truly over. In this world, people like Lisa always had a way of crawling back, hoping to snatch whatever scraps they could find. I needed to prepare for any eventuality. We couldn't afford to let our guard down, not yet. So, I worked with my lawyer to secure every aspect of our new life. I created new accounts, locked down assets, and took steps to ensure that neither Lisa nor Dante would have any access to us in the future. I even changed our phone numbers and contacted the authorities to update our privacy settings, ensuring our personal information remained protected. I would do anything to keep my son safe and to prevent any chance of Lisa disrupting our lives again. As the weeks passed, our new routines began to feel normal. My son and I spent more time together than ever before, and we grew closer, bound by what we had endured. One night, over a quiet dinner, he opened up about something that had been bothering him. "Dad, I know she hurt us," he began, "but I can't stop thinking about what could have been different." "Do you ever feel like that?" I paused, taking in his words. I'd spent so much time fighting, planning, and executing my revenge that I hadn't allowed myself to consider the pain beneath it all. There was anger, yes, but also a lingering sadness for the family we might have been if things had gone differently. I reached across the table and squeezed his shoulder. "I do, son. But sometimes, we have to accept that people make their choices, and those choices define them." He nodded, seeming to understand, though I knew we both carried scars that would take time to heal. But I also realized that, in some ways, we were stronger for it. The bond we shared now, forged in hardship, was unbreakable. In the days that followed, we settled into a comfortable rhythm. We talked more openly about our hopes and plans, and I saw in him a resilience that made me proud. He wasn't just my son, he was my partner in rebuilding our lives. We started making plans for the future, talking about trips we'd take and projects we'd start together. And as for Lisa and Dante, I heard through my lawyer that they had both accepted plea deals to avoid longer sentences. Their lives were effectively over, reduced to nothing but the consequences of their own choices. And knowing that brought a sense of closure I hadn't anticipated. For the first time in a long while, I could finally breathe freely. Looking back, I knew that there were moments I wished I could erase, pain I wished I hadn't felt. But through it all, we'd come out the other side. We were free, and we were together, and in the end, that was more than enough. Just as my son and I were beginning to settle into our new lives, thinking the worst was over, an unexpected knock on the door shattered that illusion. Two men in suits stood there, flashing badges from the FBI. I felt my stomach twist as they explained why they were there. They needed to talk about Lisa. They led us to their unmarked car, where we sat across from one of the agents while the other stood outside, watching for anyone who might approach. The agent looked me straight in the eye, his expression grave. "Mr. Thompson, we've been investigating your ex-wife for quite some time. We believe she's been involved in a network of financial crimes tied to an organized crime syndicate." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew she had stolen from me, betrayed me in every way, but this? This was beyond anything I could have imagined. I asked the agent for more details, and what he told me left me stunned. Lisa had been laundering money through her spa business. At first, it was just small amounts here and there. But over time, she got involved with people who were far more dangerous than Dante. The money she took from me was just the tip of the iceberg, and she'd been hiding vast sums for years. Her connections stretched beyond simple theft. She was deeply involved in a syndicate responsible for trafficking drugs and laundering millions through legitimate businesses like her spa. As if that wasn't enough, the agent went on to explain that Lisa had also been working as a mole within the network. She'd been passing information to the authorities about her criminal associates to save herself, hoping to leverage her knowledge to avoid prison time. But it backfired, and when her handlers in the syndicate found out, they threatened her life. She had been trying to disappear with Dante as a last-ditch effort to escape not just the law, but these ruthless people she had once worked with. My son looked at me, horror etched on his face. This wasn't just about us or our family anymore, we were entangled in something far darker. Lisa's secrets had put us in real danger. The agent handed me a file with documents and photographs, images of Lisa meeting with known criminals, proof of her dealings and betrayals. I couldn't believe it. It felt like a nightmare, but there was no waking up from this. "What does this mean for us?" I asked, my voice barely steady. The agent nodded solemnly. "We believe you may be at risk. Those involved in the syndicate might target you or your son, assuming you know more than you do. They advised us to stay low and offered to put us in a temporary protection program until the full scope of her activities was uncovered." As they left, the weight of the situation settled over me. Lisa's web of lies and deception had ensnared us, dragging us into a world we wanted no part of. My son and I were now at risk because of her choices. This was no longer just a fight for justice, it was a fight for survival. We were entangled in a deadly game, and the stakes had never been higher. We had thought we were free, but now it was clear that Lisa's dark secrets would haunt us far longer than we had ever imagined. I was determined to protect my son, no matter the cost. We would face this together, and we wouldn't let Lisa's sins destroy us. The battle wasn't over yet. If anything, it had just begun. The following days were a blur of tension and preparation. Knowing we were under threat from people Lisa had associated with forced us to rethink every aspect of our lives. I accepted the FBI's offer of temporary protection, moving my son and me to a safe house while they assessed the full scope of Lisa's connections. It was a small, plain cabin in the woods, far removed from the city, but it felt like a fortress amidst the uncertainty. Life in hiding was surreal. We were cut off from our usual routines, isolated and always on edge. My son and I filled the time with games and conversations, trying to keep our minds occupied, but the shadow of danger lingered, never allowing us to fully relax. Every creak of the floor, every sound outside, felt like a threat. One evening, as we sat on the porch overlooking the dark woods, my son asked, "Do you think they'll find us here?" His voice was quiet, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He tried to be brave, but I knew the fear was there, just beneath the surface. "We're safe," I assured him, though the words felt hollow. I wanted to believe it as much as he did. Days passed in uneasy silence. The FBI agents assigned to us came by occasionally to check in, bringing updates that provided little comfort. They'd found more connections between Lisa and the crime syndicate, uncovering a network of shell companies and fraudulent investments she'd used to launder money. But each new piece of information only deepened the mystery and confirmed that we were tangled in something far larger than I'd initially imagined. Then, one night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. My heart raced as I listened, holding my breath. The footsteps were steady, purposeful, as if whoever was out there knew exactly where we were. I moved silently to my son's room, putting my hand on his shoulder to wake him, signaling for silence. We hid in the small closet, listening as the footsteps grew closer, then suddenly stopped. My phone vibrated with a message from one of the agents. "We're outside. Stay inside and lock all doors." Relief washed over me as I realized the footsteps belonged to our protection detail, but it served as a reminder that we were far from safe. I clutched my son close as we waited in the darkness, hearing the agents outside securing the perimeter. Eventually, they gave the all-clear, but the tension remained. The following morning, one of the agents sat us down and spoke bluntly. "The syndicate knows who you are, and they know about Lisa. There's a high likelihood they'll attempt to make contact with you." He explained that the safe house could only protect us for so long. We needed a permanent solution, a way to cut all ties to Lisa's past and ensure they had no reason to come after us. That evening, I made a decision. I called my lawyer and arranged to sell off everything tied to Lisa, her spa, any remaining assets in our old home, and the last connections to her past life. It was painful, letting go of what little was left of our old life, but I knew it was necessary. I wanted no trace of her left in our lives, nothing for the syndicate to latch onto, no lingering reminders of her deceit. As we packed the few belongings we had, I turned to my son, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. "This isn't the life I wanted for us," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But we're going to start over, somewhere far away. We're going to be safe." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "As long as we're together, that's all that matters," he replied. His words gave me strength, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. We would leave everything behind, rebuild somewhere new, and finally be free from the shadows of Lisa's betrayal. That night, as we drove away from the cabin under the cover of darkness, I felt a sense of closure. We were moving forward, breaking free from the tangled web Lisa had woven around us. We didn't know what lay ahead, but we had each other. And that, I realized, was more than enough. A few weeks after we'd settled into our new location, life started to feel almost normal again. We had chosen a small town, far from the chaos we had left behind. But as hard as we tried, we couldn't escape the shadows of Lisa's secrets. I had just started to believe we were free, but that illusion was shattered by a phone call one evening. It was an unknown number, and when I picked up, I heard a voice I hadn't expected. "Mr. Thompson," the voice said calmly. "We need to talk about Lisa's son." For a moment, I froze. I assumed he was talking about my son, but the tone suggested something else. "You must be mistaken," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "My son is here with me." But the caller, who introduced himself as an investigator, insisted on meeting me, saying that there were things I needed to know. Against my better judgment, I agreed, arranging to meet him at a nearby cafe the next day. When I arrived, he slid a file across the table. "Lisa had a child, not long after you two were married. I believe you know about him?" I nodded, recalling the photos and documents we'd found in the storage unit. But as I opened the file, my heart sank. The child in the photos wasn't the baby I had seen in those old pictures. The investigator explained that Lisa's son was alive and had been raised by another man, one who had recently been arrested on unrelated charges. And then he delivered the bombshell: Elisa had given birth to twins. While one of the babies had stayed with her in secret, the other had been sent to live with the father, a man Lisa had been involved with long before we'd met. And the shocking part? The investigator handed me a DNA report. The boy was my biological son. The room spun as I tried to process this revelation. I had a son, another child, who had been hidden from me his entire life. This meant that while I had been raising our son, another of my own flesh and blood had been out there, unaware of who I was. I felt a mix of betrayal and sorrow. Lisa had stolen not just my trust, my money, but now a child, my own son. I asked the investigator how this was possible, how I could have never known. He explained that Lisa had kept the pregnancy hidden until after we were married. She'd then arranged for the second baby to be adopted by this other man, cutting me out of the picture completely. All these years, Lisa had concealed her double life with one of the most unforgivable lies. I left the cafe in a daze, barely able to think straight. When I got home, I knew I had to tell my son. He deserved to know the truth. I sat him down and shared what I had learned, watching as confusion, anger, and disbelief crossed his face. But then something unexpected happened. He stood up, his expression firm. "We have to find him, Dad. He's my brother." I looked at him, seeing the determination in his eyes, and knew he was right. We couldn't let this end here. I owed it to my other son to finally bring him into our lives, to give him the family he had never known. We had fought so hard to escape Lisa's secrets, and now we had to confront one of the biggest ones she had left behind. The next steps would be complicated, painful even, but I was ready. No matter how long it took or what it involved, I was determined to find him. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of purpose. I was about to rebuild the family that Lisa had tried to keep from me. We were ready to uncover the truth and bring my son home. In the weeks after the truth about my second son came to light, I found myself staring down a long road filled with uncertainty and emotional landmines. Knowing I had another son, one I had never met, who had been hidden from me his whole life, made the ground feel unsteady beneath my feet. But there was no time to hesitate. I'd already lost too much to Lisa's lies, and I wasn't going to let them rob me of another moment. It was time to pick up the pieces. First, I had to make sure everything was legal. I knew that this wasn't going to be a simple reunion, I needed custody rights and proof of my relationship to him. The paperwork was endless, and every day seemed to drag as we went through court hearings, filing after filing. During one of the hearings, my lawyer leaned over to me and whispered, "Brace yourself. We may have to testify about why you didn't know." I nodded, my stomach sinking as I realized that my failings would be laid bare for everyone to see. Once the legal groundwork was in place, the court ordered a supervised meeting. The anticipation nearly broke me, but my son was there, steady and supportive, reminding me that we were doing this together. When the day finally came, the nerves hit hard. The meeting room was stark, with harsh lighting and an old clock ticking loudly, reminding me of just how long it had been since this boy had come into the world without me by his side. He walked in, and there he was, a teenager, tall and wiry, with a wary look in his eyes. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just stood there watching me as if he was trying to gauge my intentions. I introduced myself, stumbled over my words, and then just blurted out, "I'm sorry. I didn't know about you until now." It wasn't much, but it was the truth. As we spoke, I told him about his half-brother, about our life, about everything we'd been through. I told him that we wanted him to be part of our family if he was willing. He was quiet, processing it all, and then he nodded. "I don't know if I can just jump into this, but I want to try," he said, his voice almost a whisper. His answer cracked open a door that I'd feared might remain shut forever. Over the next few months, we visited him regularly. My first son was hesitant at first but soon warmed up. They both shared a dry sense of humor, and I could tell they were starting to bond. There were moments when they would exchange a look, some unspoken connection, and I'd feel a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could build something real from all this. But it wasn't easy. My new son had his guard up, and every time we made progress, I felt him pull back, retreating behind a wall I couldn't quite reach. One night, he opened up just a little, telling me about the man who had raised him, a man who had lied to him about his real father. "It's hard to trust people when you've been lied to for so long," he said, looking at me with a mixture of anger and sadness. I understood that. Lisa had taken a piece of his life, just as she had taken a piece of mine. But I was determined not to let that be the end of our story. I made a promise to him, that no matter what, I would be there. It wouldn't erase the past, but it was all I had to give. When the courts finally granted me custody, it felt both like a victory and a weight. I had another son now, legally and officially, but I knew the hardest work was yet to come. Rebuilding trust would take time we could only get by walking through the pain together. We moved into a new house, a small place in a quiet neighborhood, and started from scratch. It was a strange mix of the old and new, trying to blend two lives that had never been together. One evening, while unpacking boxes, I found an old photo of me and Lisa, from before everything fell apart. I stared at it for a long time, feeling the pull of memories I wanted to forget but knew I never could. My new son saw me and came over, looking at the photo with a blank expression. "She really messed up, didn't she?" he asked. I nodded, putting the photo face down in the box. "Yeah, she did. But we're going to make it right. One day at a time." He didn't say anything, but for the first time, he smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but it was real. In that moment, I knew that we had a chance. We weren't whole, not yet, but we were on our way. As we sat down to dinner that night, I looked at both my sons, feeling the weight of the past and the hope of the future collide. The journey was far from over, and we all bore scars that wouldn't heal overnight. But we were together, and that was more than I had dared to hope for. There would be no easy fixes, no clean slates. But there would be honesty, trust, and a willingness to rebuild. And this time, we would write our own story.